Now we come to verse 24 in James chapter 2. And it's a very fascinating verse because it's a hinge verse. So it's summing up what's come before and is about to look forward to what's ahead. The verse says, "You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone." Well, that verse has had loads of controversy through the years, but for not any good reason, as far as I can tell, if we slow down and read it. First thing you notice is that when it says, "You see that a person," so in James 2:24, it starts with "you see" in this version. But in verse 22, two verses before it, it says, "You see that faith was working." So we read, "You see that faith was working, and you see that a person is justified." So James is expressing a conclusion, but here's what's fascinating. The "you see" in verse 22, "you see that faith was working," is in the second person singular. Now, what that means is he's saying you to a particular you. Well, who would that be? Well, in the context, that particular you is the adversary. Because going all the way back to verse 20, when he began to address him, this fool-headed person, he's laying out an argument that relates and explains and magnifies the role of works, especially when they're added to faith. When works and faith synergize, when they work together, as he says in verse 22. So this argument is directed towards that adversary in that verse. When we get to our verse, verse 24, and it says, "You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone," that "you see" is second person plural. We in Alabama would say y'all. So in verse 22, it says, "You, the adversary, see that faith, blah, blah." And then in verse 24, "Y'all see that a person is." So what James has done, he's now shifted to return back to his readers, and he's addressing the whole group. That doesn't leave out the adversary, but it includes a lot more in terms of the really specific address. So appreciating that distinction helps us understand why this transition verse is so vital, because it, as a controversial verse, has been misunderstood, partly because not saying he's directing it to everyone and not saying that he was just talking to the adversary. But now it's specifically focused on the works aspect. And he says that a person is justified by works. Now, that's a pretty straightforward statement. But then it adds, "and not by faith alone." So if you're of the Roman Catholic persuasion, this has been a great verse over the centuries to say the one time the Bible talks about faith alone is when it says it does not justify, but instead says works justify. Now, before you go crazy with that, there's a little bit of a problem because he says the works justify. It's not a combination of faith and works. That would be the more traditional Roman Catholic view, that you're in by faith, but then it's completed, we might say, by works. I've addressed this elsewhere in detail. Well, when you appreciate that, you've got to appreciate that James is up to something a little different than just simply saying you're justified by the combination of faith and works, because he doesn't say that. The Westminster Calvinist type view takes it in a different way. You see, a person is justified works not by faith alone. They're saying, they want it to say rather, that faith leads to works, and these works justify essentially the faith because they prove that the faith was real. However, that's the adversary's position, and it's not what James is saying. So a little more nerdy grammar here is to understand that this passage, when he addresses that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone, it's that phrase, faith alone, which really is the problem. The problem in translations is they take that as an adjective. Now, what does that mean? Well, an adjective modifies a noun. So she has lips, but we could say she has red lips. The word red has to do with modifying the lips. The lips are the thing, the noun, but the red is that adjective. And in English, what we can do is we can put a word like very in front of it. So very red lips. You can kind of tell it's an adjective. I think it's the way they taught us as kids to recognize what's going on. So when we read this verse and it says, not by faith alone, they want that alone to be an adjective that modifies faith. But that gets weird because it would be a very alone faith. The translation goes in other directions where some place it as not by faith only. And there's a bit of a nuance there. Not by faith only suggests in that combination. Not by faith alone is more against the alone idea, but it could still be the combination. The fact is that the word alone there is an adverb. That means it goes with a verb, not a noun. And that verb is the word justified. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone, meaning not justified by faith only. Now, here's the trick. When that adverb sits there, a better translation would be something like, you see that a person is justified by works and not only by faith. That doesn't entirely solve it for us, but it gets closer. Because what James is actually getting at is that there are two justifications. There are probably many more, but in his mind, he's talking about two. This has been his proof to the adversary about how important and valuable works are when they synergize with faith. When one has faith and works, that combination produces something pretty awesome. And so in this context, when he's describing these two justifications, he's basically saying, look, there's not just justification by faith, which there is, and he said it in verse 23, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. That is one of them. But also you can see that a person is justified by works. So works play this strategic leveraged role that when they're added to what's being believed in that moment, that has the effect of generating or bringing about a response of approval from God toward the person. But rather it being that faith proposition where you're approved eternally, it's now a relational proposition. You're approved in the moment. We discussed that last time as it gets down to what it means that we can be a friend of God, that Abraham in particular was this friend of God. What's fun is I can demonstrate it to you without having to fiddle with all the grammar and nuances and go, well, is he really right? Do I need to look up a grammarian? I wonder what AI says. You can do all that. But here's the thing. We can substitute words for the nouns and the verbs and still get the flavor of the sentence. We're not saying it says the same thing, but we can understand it. This comes from Blaise Pascal, who was fond of reminding us to do this sort of thing because we get locked into a word meaning or to a phrase meaning. And when we do that, we're in trouble because it tends to just be a confirmation bias, a reinforcing loop where we just keep seeing what we want to see and not what's there. So let's do that. I'm going to substitute the word justified with the word frightened. I'm going to substitute works with vampire, and I'm going to substitute faith with zombie. So here it goes. It says you see a person is justified by works and not by faith alone, right? And so we're wrestling with what's that talking about. But watch what happens. You see that a person is frightened by vampires and not by zombies alone. Or you can fill it with the plurals and whatever. But think about it. You see that a person is frightened, scared by vampires and not by zombies alone. So, what does that mean? Well, it means that a person can be frightened by vampires. That's one way. Or by zombies. But it's specifically not zombies as the only thing on the planet that can frighten a person. But rather, if you are frightened by vampires and not by zombies alone, it means there are other things that can frighten you. If you want to twist that into something like, well, that means it takes both a vampire and a zombie together at the same time to really frighten anybody, that would be ludicrous. You wouldn't look at this and see that a person is frightened by vampires and not by zombies alone. A zombie has to be hand in hand or arm in arm with a vampire to frighten. That's not the grammar. That's not the language. It's not the meaning. But that's what people do with this passage. They think person is justified by works and not by faith alone means that faith and works have to be hand in hand to justify. Not what he's talking about. Look, he's telling you there are two approvals. One is by faith alone. Well, not by faith alone, by faith, let's say it that way. That is one of them. And that by faith justification is eternal, everlasting. It is that credit of righteousness. But this other one that he just proved, this approval by works, is that friendship of God, being righteous in real time approval. Now, I want to throw out a couple of other quick things here in appreciating what James is getting at. And that is that faith alone phrase could be, as I've thought about it, it could be a noun phrase. So it's two words together, and then it becomes a category of a thing. So it's faith alone, it's a thing. And so it's not talking like alone modifies it, but it's a certain kind of faith. It's a kind of faith alone. So if that's the truth and it's taken that way, then arguing you see a person is justified by works and not by the kind of faith that is alone or something like that, lone faith or whatever. But it all runs into the same problem. It's insisting on not only a grammatical shift that is unusual or perhaps not even allowed, but is also dependent on a theology or a view coming in and telling it what to say. And that's always sort of the problem. Seems to me, I like to say in the book, that theology is fiction and theologians are novelists. Now, I'm not picking on anybody. What I'm saying is the Bible wasn't written as a theology. It's just not written that way. So when we put together our theologies, we're constructing them from the pieces. I like my theology. I'm a fan of it. And yay, team. But I don't want to get us busy battling over theologies rather than over the text, because the text is what actually makes the difference. Well, I want to give you a final example in this passage of why it's problematical to walk into something like James and start dictating to its meaning a theology that one has. So when James in verse 224 says, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone, well, there's a certain group out there that aligns with the adversary, that aligns with the Westminster Confession, that claims that what James is talking about in chapter 2 is saving faith, and that by that they mean eternally saving faith. So back to our insight from Pascal, we can substitute that in there. We can put saving faith in that sentence and see if it makes sense. Because quite honestly, if that's what's going on, it should, if that's what he's talking about. But watch what happens. You see that a person is justified by works and not by saving faith alone. Well, the way that reads is a person is saved by works and is not saved by saving faith. Because not by saving faith alone means saving faith has to have something else. Well, yea, the Catholic view, but devastating to the Westminster Confession view, because it's not what he's talking about. Both the Catholics and the Confessionalists both miss the context is about a judgment evaluation of the bema based on what we hear and do, say, do, our faith combined with works, all that stuff, all that Christian integrity that's so vital in the thinking and the writing of James here. But if you imagine that it's talking about getting into heaven here, and then you imagine that faith is not everyday faith, not something like in 2:15-16, be warmed, be filled. I believe people should be warmed and filled. I believe brothers and sisters in Christ should be cared for. Good. Did you take action? No. But that's the idea. It's that kind of practical, everyday faith. And so, specifically, when you miss that and then impose on it a definition of saving faith, you wind up having to read your sentences like, do you see a person is justified by works and not by saving faith alone? And you, in that moment, have destroyed your own doctrine. There's no reason for that. Because James is just telling us simply, following up in this whole discussion on Abraham, that you can see now to everyone, not just the avatary, y'all can see. And what y'all can see is that a person is justified by works, as he just showed with Abraham, not Abraham's faith, Abraham himself. He was approved by works when he offered his son. And it's not only faith that is one of the ways in which we can get justified. And now we get to move on to Rahab. Join us next time. Would you do me a favor and subscribe, and do a friend a favor and share?